Today we're going to take a look at two freshly painted motorcycle tanks and deal with some common imperfections like orange peel and dust nibs. I'm going to show you how we take these two tanks and give them a slick as glass mirror finish. Hey, I'm James from Slipstream Creations. We recently painted these two customized Honda CB360 tanks for a couple of Suzuki Van 200 builds that we're currently working on. We're just about ready to get these bikes put back together, but there are a couple of imperfections in the paint that we want to take care of first. And if you've ever done any painting like this on your own at home, then you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. But it's the type of thing that professional painters deal with on a regular basis as well. So the key is just to know when these types of problems do pop up, how do we deal with them? And make sure to stick around until the end of the video where I'll share a little bit more about the types of tools and materials that I like to use and where you can find the right gear for yourself at home. So let's first identify the types of problems that we're trying to address. At first glance, both of these tanks look pretty good, but if we look a little bit closer, we can see there are a few imperfections that really keep them from looking great. The first thing we're going to see here is what's really most typical, and that's just dust and debris. There are ways that we can deal with that debris during painting, and that's a topic for another video, but these guys are going to be almost impossible to entirely avoid. The other thing that you're always going to see is a little bit of orange peel. And the thing about orange peel is that every motorcycle and every car is going to have a little bit of it straight from the factory. I painted both of these tanks with a paint gun that I don't typically use for clear, so the settings I used were a little bit different from tank to tank. And you can see that that results in a little bit different texture of the orange peel on each of these tanks. We're going to remove essentially all of it anyway, so we'll have a totally flat surface to polish. One other little thing that we'll notice on this red tank is what looks like tiny little pinpricks sort of all over the surface of it. That's either a tiny bit of solvent pop right on the surface of the tank, or just there were some solvents in the air in the booth that ended up settling and causing a little bit of that texture here. So really difficult to see. I'm not worried about it since we're going to address all of that when we take care of the orange peel. The first thing that we're going to knock out is taking care of these dust nibs. And this should really only take a few minutes. The idea here is that we want to basically take the tops of those nibs and flatten them out really without affecting the surrounding area as much as we can. So I've got a little 1500 grit paper on this toll cut block. And you can see we've got this little dust nib here. I'm going to take this block and I'm just going to very gently run it across the top of that nib. And you can see there's a little high spot right in the middle, and you can see it's still shiny around the edges. That's exactly where the dust nib is. And so I'll gently take my block, and I'm just going to work that until those nibs, or until this nib is completely gone. Now you use these toll cut blocks dry, so they will clog up a little bit. I like to use a little bit of paper towel just to clear that out. But I'm only going to sand until that little shiny ring around that dust nib is gone. And we can see that one is totally flattened out now. We've got another one right here, so I'm just going to do the same thing with it. Again, we can see there's a little shiny ring around that dust nib. As I'm careful to keep that spot nice and small, we can see that I'm just flattening the top of that out with minimal effect on the surrounding area. If you don't want to invest in a file or a toll cut block, you can use a wooden paint mixing stick like this and a strip of 1200 grit water dry sandpaper, and just wrap it around, wrap the paper around your stick like this, so that you've got a nice hard flat surface that you can use to sand. The key is that we want a hard flat surface that we can knock the tops off of those dust nibs without affecting the surrounding area too much. So I'll spray a little water on this sandpaper and use this mixing stick exactly the same way I would use that toll cut block. You can see we have that same little high spot in the middle. We'll just sand this until there's no more shiny spot there. Got just a little more at the top. We were lucky that between both of these tanks, we only had a couple of dirt nibs to deal with, so it really only took us a few minutes. We're ready to move on to the next step now, which is flattening out all of this orange peel so we have a perfectly smooth finish before we start polishing. The tool we're going to use for that is a DA sander. On the DA sander here, you can see that we've got a soft foam interface pad to give us a little bit more of a forgiving surface to go over the contoured curves of the motorcycle tank. And then on here, we've got a 1500 grit hook and loop sandpaper pad from 3M. There are a couple of things that we'll be doing here that we want to be really careful about. We're obviously removing clear coat, so we don't want to be too aggressive with it. And then we also want to be really careful around these edges and body lines. Any of these hard edges are going to be really easy for us to accidentally burn through the clear coat into the paint, maybe even into bare metal, especially if you're using a powered DA sander like this. The other thing that we need to be very careful of is we need to keep the surface nice and clean. So I'm using a clean microfiber cloth. I'm going to clean the surface frequently. And then we're going to hit this with the DA. So what we're going to do first is we're going to hit this just real gently across the surface. And we should be able to see the high spots and the low spots the same way we did with the dirt nibs. So let me clean that off. And you can get a real good idea from looking here at where all the high spots and low spots are. So little shiny spots are the valleys, and we've knocked the tops off of the hills here. So we're gonna go ahead and use the DA, get all of the large surfaces here on the tank done, and then we'll come back and be really careful about the smaller areas around the edges. So now that we've got our first pass with the DA using 1500 grit, you can see that we have a much smoother surface now. And if you're careful and you look in the reflections, you can see that it's really nice and slick. So next step is going to be to go to 2000 grit. We'll work our way all the way up to 3000. But notice in areas along the edges here, there's a little bit of peel left there. So we'll try to get that out with finer grit. And then up here, where it's going to be difficult to polish, we left a little bit of a gap here as well. So if this were really going to be a show bike and not a daily rider, then we probably would get in here by hand and do all of this very carefully by hand. But you have to keep in mind that the more you polish on this and the more you sand it, the more clear you're removing. So we want to leave as much clear as we can, but avoid some of these edges just so that we don't get into any trouble sort of burning through or having a hard time getting those polished out. The next step for us is going to be to use a 3000 grit pad. This has an additional little layer of foam in it, and I'll actually use this wet. So I'll spray a little bit of water on the surface and a little bit on the pad, because this is going to actually start the polishing process for us a little bit. And it goes a little bit faster. If we could go straight to compound right now and start buffing it, but if we go to the 3000 grit, things will go a little bit smoother and a little bit quicker. So if we look at the surface now, we can see the areas where we've hit it with the 3000 grit wet versus the 2000 grit dry up here. We can start to see those areas where it's almost starting to polish it out just using the sandpaper. Now that we've taken care of the dirt and the orange peel, this is when things start to get a little bit more exciting, because we've spent most of our effort so far really removing the shine from this clear coat. Now we're going to start to bring that shine back. I like to use a big rotary buffer and a wool pad for this stage. I know that orbital buffers and foam pads have gotten really popular, but I think that the wool pad and the rotary cuts a lot quicker. Because these spin really quickly, we need to be extra careful with these. I'm not going to put any pressure on it. I'm just going to use the weight of the buffer itself to apply pressure to the surface. And I also need to keep in mind that this pad is going to turn clockwise. So as this pad turns, I want it to sort of run off of the edge as it polishes, rather than the opposite way where it might catch the edge. I like to put a little bit of compound on the surface as opposed to the pad. And then I'll start with just a couple of quick little pulses. So I'm just spreading out the compound first, and then we'll use real light, gentle pressure. So as we start to make a little bit of progress with the buffer and things are starting to look pretty slick, I like to use a light of some sort. This is a little sun gun. A flashlight would work great as well. So even though things look great with just the regular shop lights, as soon as this thing gets out in the sun, all of these little scratches and fine scratches and imperfections will be revealed. And so using a light source of some sort or a sun gun like this can be really handy. Now, once we get all of the major flat surfaces done with the big rotary buffer, I like to switch to a small pneumatic orbital buffer here. That makes it real easy to get into tight spots here, like around the filler neck, around the seams, and around the edges of the tank. That's just somewhere the big rotary buffer can't get. Once we've double checked everything and we're through with that compounding step, we're sure that we don't have any swirl marks or scratches or anything in there that we haven't addressed, we're ready to move on to the next step, which is to basically do the same thing all over again with a finer compound. This is actually a polish, and I'm going to use a foam pad first on the rotary buffer. Once we've done that with the rotary, we'll go over the whole thing again with a foam pad and a DA or an orbital buffer, and then we should be all good to go. These tanks turned out great. We took care of the dust nibs and orange peel and managed to polish both of them up to really a mirror shine, and it only took a couple of hours. If you're trying this out at home, err on the side of caution. If you remember, in order to get this level of shine, we had to remove some clear coat, and once that clear is gone, there's no bringing it back, not without a repaint. So just be extra cautious, especially around edges and body lines and curves on the tank. And keep in mind, you could always do more. If these were show bikes, we could spend a ton of extra time really working through these fine details. But these two tanks in particular, these are for dual sport bikes, and they were meant to be ridden. We've already given them way better than factory finish. I mentioned earlier in the video that I wanted to share a few details about the types of tools and materials I like to use here. So we'll take a look at what I've got, talk about a few pros and cons, and maybe give you a little bit of insight that helps you decide what gear is appropriate for you at home. But the number one thing to remember is don't get too hung up on the tools. If you really want a great shine and a great finish, the most important thing is going to be the amount of effort and time that you put in, not the tools themselves. Now, the tools are great because they'll help make life easier and it'll make the process faster, but you definitely can make do without them. So we'll take a look at what we've got, kind of go through the process from start to finish, give you a few pros and cons on these tools, and go from there. The first step we're going to deal with is nib sanding. Now, I really like these toll cut blocks. These are a little hard rubber block from a company called Kovacs Abrasives. Now, what's nice about these is not only the size, they're very small, but the abrasive come in these little adhesive plastic pads that stick right onto the block. So you use these pads dry, you don't have to use any water, so there's no sort of wet mess. And also, it's a really hard block. So it makes a great surface for knocking down the top of those nibs without really affecting the surrounding area too much. So I really like these. They also come in a couple of different sizes and different shapes for different materials or different tank shapes, surface shapes that you might be working with. These are great. Now, if I wasn't doing this professionally, would I bother investing in these toll cut blocks? They're not expensive, but I also don't know that they're worth it if you're going to do one tank. So they work great, but not better enough than just a disposable wooden paint stir stick and some disposable wet or dry sandpaper. So either of those are great options and both will give you good results. The next step in the process is going to be removing orange peel. And I like to use a DA sander for removing orange peel. Now this is going to require an air compressor. And DA sanders tend to use a fairly high volume of air, so a big compressor is going to be really helpful. Now that's not that big of a deal on a motorcycle tank because it's small, but if you were sanding an entire car, you definitely would need a big compressor to get through the job. But what's great about these is that they make really quick work of orange peel, and they're not an expensive tool. Now this is an old one. This is from Ingersoll Rand. I've had this one for probably 15 years. Still works great. This is a name brand, a little bit more expensive one. You can get them from Harbor Freight. I've got DA sanders from Harbor Freight that work great as well. So you don't have to spend a lot, and they really generally will last a long time. You do have to keep in mind that some of them are made for adhesive paper. This has a backing pad for adhesive paper. And then some of them are hook and loop, which is sort of Velcro-like. I actually prefer the hook and loop, and most of my DA sanders use the hook and loop paper. Along with the DA, you're going to have some abrasive that works with them. I like these 3M purple finishing discs. Now, obviously, if you're doing this at home, you're not going to go buy a 50-pack of this 3M paper. The 3M stuff is expensive, but it does work well. Generally, these more expensive abrasives, like from 3M, they won't clog as much. The abrasives will last a little bit longer, and they may be a little bit more consistent, but you can totally make do with less expensive abrasives, and there are a lot of options online. So here I've got 1500, 2000, and then our 3000 Trizact discs that I use with a little bit of water as well. So that kind of has you covered for removing orange peel. Now, if you don't have a compressor and don't want to buy a DA sander, you can do this by hand as well. I've spent many hours removing orange peel by hand, and oftentimes you'll just use a foam block like this. This is a flexible sanding block. The gray side is a little bit softer, the dark side is a little bit harder, but you can wrap your wet or dry sandpaper around this and sand out all of that orange peel by hand with no trouble. Another great option, if you go to your local auto parts store like an AutoZone or O'Reilly, you may find these sanding sponges. Now this one's 400 grit, so you wouldn't want to use this for finishing, but you can see that it's a nice soft sanding sponge, and you can use this wet as well. Comes in all sorts of grits, and this makes a great option for removing orange peel too. Once we're done with the orange peel, the next step is polishing. So as I mentioned, I like to use a big rotary buffer, and that is maybe a little bit oversized for a motorcycle tank, but it works great on cars, obviously. You just have to be really careful on a small motorcycle tank. Make sure that the tank is secured so that you don't bump it or knock it off the table, because these rotary buffers are a little bit heavy. And also make sure that you're very careful about not catching an edge of, I mentioned I like to use wool pads. It's really easy to catch the edge of your tank and either really shake it or bump it. And you can burn through the edges of, body contours and lines like that as well with a big buffer. But it does go really fast, which is a really useful feature. This, again, This is a Bauer Harbor Freight polisher. It works just great for me. If I can get away with not spending a ton of money on tools, I prefer to do that. I've used Makitas in the past. I've had a Hitachi in the past and a DeWalt, and they all work fine as well. But they cost 2 to 3 times as much as this Bauer one from Harbor Freight, and the Harbor Freight one works just fine. Now, if I don't want to use a big buffer like that, there are these handheld battery-operated polishers as well. So this has a little 12-volt battery that's rechargeable, and sometimes you could do a whole tank with a handheld unit like this. They also work great for small areas around the filler neck and areas where a big buffer can't get. This is also from Harbor Freight. There's a nearly identical one from Milwaukee that costs 3 to 4 times as much. Doesn't really work any better. I should take that back. It may work marginally better, or the battery life may be marginally better, but ultimately we've got a pad that's spinning in a circle, so it's not a complex machine. These are a pretty good deal. You can get these at Harbor Freight, like I said, as well. I think Ryobi makes them also. So there are a lot of options for a small handheld battery-operated version. Once we've made it through that step, I usually will go to, I have a little pneumatic DA sander, and so I will use this for a little bit of nib sanding or a little bit of orange peel removal as well with sandpaper, but this works great with foam pads or wool pads also. And what's nice about an orbital style buffer is that you won't get sort of swirl marks the way you might with a rotary buffer. So this does a good job of removing those types of marks and giving you a nice clean final finish. Again, you'll need an air compressor to make this work. Now this handheld unit won't use as much air as a big DA, but you will need some sort of compressed air to make it work. There may be battery operated versions out there or plug-in versions that I'm not familiar with, but this is a handy little tool. And then oftentimes when I'm all done, I'll go back to the DA I used for sanding and put a wool pad or a foam pad on this, and I'll do my final polishing with a foam pad on this DA as well. So definitely have some options there. In order to make any of that work, obviously we have to have some sort of compound, rubbing compound and polishing compound. I like to use this Meguiar's compound. This is the Meguiar's Ultra Cut compound. It's number 105. This is a rougher cutting compound that we'll use in the first stage to remove our 3000 grit sanding scratches from when we were removing our orange peel. So this will be a nice rough cut, and then we'll follow that up with a finer polish, which is a much finer abrasive. This is the 205 from Meguiar's, and you'll really need at least those 2 steps with whatever materials you're using. I like Meguiar's because I can kind of get it everywhere. The paint store that I use carries this same Meguiar's setup. Harbor Freight carries this. Most of your auto parts stores like AutoZone will carry this as well, and even in smaller quantities, because these are relatively big bottles. So Meguiar's is a great option. I've used 3M in the past. I used to use it all the time. Also great material, but a lot more expensive. It's harder to find. I can only get it at the paint store I use, or you can order it online, but it's a lot more expensive, like I said. So Meguiar's is a really good option. You just need to be sure that you get a cutting compound and a polish as sort of the 2 main steps. You could follow those up with a hand glaze or an even finer polish, but I generally find if you do a good job with this polish, that's about all you need. And the only other thing that I really try to make sure I've got a lot of is I buy big packs of these microfiber cloths. So these you can get on Amazon. I'm sure you can get them in all sorts of places. Again, if you have a Harbor Freight nearby, they often have coupons for little multicolored packs of microfiber cloths. So just for a couple of bucks, or sometimes they give them away free. So I like to stock up on these. And when you do run out of them, you can either buy more or you can put these in the washer and reuse them. So really important to keep your surfaces clean and dirt-free when you're polishing and sanding. So keep a lot of microfibers on hand. And that's really it. As I said, I don't get too hung up on the tools. I don't get too hung up on name brands of tools. So if I can find a good deal, whether it's at Harbor Freight or Amazon or Home Depot, I'm always looking for those options. Thanks for sticking around. Hopefully some of that information was useful to you. I'd love to hear your thoughts or tips or suggestions below in the comments, and be sure to subscribe for more videos like this one.